Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in for our roundtable. So we are the Future of Human Communication Centre of Excellence, and I'm Helen Cullington, and I'm an audiologist in the Cochlear Implant Centre at the university, and I co-chair the centre with Stefan Bleek, who is the chair of the ISVR in the university. So what we want to do with the Centre of Excellence is to bring people together from all sorts of diverse areas to think about the next generation of digital technologies to help people communicate better. So we're not just thinking engineering, we're not just thinking hearing, we're thinking about entertainment, healthcare, telemedicine, people's well-being. We're thinking about the workplace, teaching, schools, further education. And really what we want to do is start thinking about the challenges for communication that we're going to have over the next few years and start coming up with some questions and ways of answering those questions. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all today, and we're going to be talking today about communicating after COVID-19. Obviously, our lives have all changed unrecognisably, really, over the past month or two, and goodness knows what's going to happen in the future in terms of what will go back to normal and what will change and what will be good about those changes and what will be difficult. So we have a panel of people here today. We're delighted to have you here. So thank you so much. And what we want to do, first I'm going to introduce you to the panel. So we're very pleased to have Professor Yehuda Baruch, who is Professor of Management at Southampton Business School. Dr. Anne-Marie Hughes is an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences. Dr. Ruby Chung is a lecturer in film at the university. Professor M.C. Schrafel is a Professor of Computer Science and Human Performance. Dr. Jane Bezic, Associate Professor of Modern Languages and Linguistics. Dr. Michael Cranert, lecturer in sociolinguistics. He's in modern languages and linguistics. And Dr. Daria Roisk, who is an associate professor in human geography. So we have an amazing, diverse group, and we're very excited to hear from you today. And first of all, really, what we wanted to do was just go around to everybody, and if you could spend a minute or two just telling us about your area of expertise and some of your personal experiences of how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed communication in your field. So can we start with Yehuda, perhaps? Would you like to start us off, please?
Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me well. My field of study is people management, and in the 90s, I conducted several studies about teleworking, working from home, and at the time, I pointed out that many people are ready and willing and could benefit, and organization can benefit from it. However, there are several factors that will prevent the widespread of teleworking unless something major change comes, especially to the organizational culture. What we're experiencing now, from my point of view, is a natural experiment where many managers that wouldn't let their employees work from home were forced to let them working from home. And suddenly, individuals and organizations realize that it is possible, it could even be more effective, and this could be a very strong way, in particularly when we go back from the COVID to normal, and it will never be normal because we change too. Some people will go back to as they used to be, but some people will adopt, and some managers will be ready to experience it. Now, this is not a usual experiment because ideally, just people will move to work from home. At the moment, for example, many people with children don't benefit fully from teleworking because they have to educate their children at the same time. So this experiment is limited in terms of experiment. It is not ideal experiment, but it is eye-opening to many people. And gives the option for many people that couldn't to experience teleworking and, as I said, benefit from it.
Thank you so much. You're right. It's an experiment that we've all been forced into, but it's fascinating, isn't it, to see how things are evolving. So, could we move on now? Ruby Chung, would you like to tell us your area of expertise and how things are changing in your field?
Okay. First of all, I would like to clarify that my job position is associate professor in film, not lecturer. My own areas of expertise is in international film industry studies, in particular, Hong Kong cinema and also Chinese language film industries. Within the specialism, I've created a subject specialism in my department. So I'm teaching undergraduate, postgraduate taught, and also PhD students in different areas of the international film industries. And one of the things that we are looking at would be film distribution and also exhibition. And because of this pandemic, the research would need to change quite a lot because some of the students would not be able to, say, for example, go to a cinema and actually do their research within that environment. They will all have to watch films at home. If they are doing research on exhibition, they will have to think about different new ways to get to source the films. So that's quite big changes to a lot of my students, and especially because of the copyright issues, not all the films that we usually require students to watch would be available online. So we will have to adjust it for them.
Thank you, Ruby. And thinking along those lines, really, there used to be, well, as far as I understand, quite a stigma involved with films going straight to streaming rather than being launched in the theatres. And is that something that you see will persist, or will that become the new normal?
The streaming, like using online platforms to see film, has been around for a while already, and I would foresee that because of the pandemic, this whole phenomenon will actually rapidly develop in the very near future. There are pros and cons, obviously, with regard to the video on demand platforms. On the one hand, of course, it would benefit a lot of different audiences who are based in different territories. But then if we only rely on these online platforms to show films to the audiences, no one would go to see films in the cinemas. And actually the cinema outlet is actually one of the major channel where films can reach out to their audiences. Usually when films are released, they would first go to theater. So the theatrical release would be used as such some sort of a benchmark to identify which film would be able to growth, more box office, and later on perhaps DVD sales, income, so on and so forth. But because of the change now, and we can't actually go to the cinemas for the time being. Some of the evaluations or the measurements that we used to use to identify these so-called the box office grosses may not happen anymore, or at least for the time being. So we don't actually quite know what will happen in the next few months.
Thank you, Ruby. That's really interesting. Daria, how about your field? How are things for you communication-wise?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in communication, but it is very relevant for my research area. So I'm mainly interested in home-based businesses and home-based self-employment. So we've heard our first speaker spoke about home working, and there is an established stand in the literature that looks at teleworking or telecommuting, which is predominantly or exclusively of employees who work mainly for larger organizations. So my focus is on businesses and how they use digital technology to trade online from home, although quite a lot of home-based businesses actually are not these very high-skilled jobs, because a lot are involved in skilled trades or personal services and domestic services. So it would be quite interesting to see how digital technology could be more used by various businesses. So we have, for example, looked at e-commerce and home-based businesses, compared the take-up of e-commerce with small businesses that are not based in the home. And in general, there is still quite a low take-up, even though compared to small businesses that are not home-based, the home-based small businesses are more likely to be involved in e-commerce and earn most of their sales from e-commerce. So we in the future, so it would be very important and to look at these issues. How can these very small businesses make more use of digital technologies? And it would be good if your center could contribute to that. I've also done research on freelancing and self-employed people. Most or all of them work from home again, and how they work on these digital platforms for skilled work. And this is quite a globalized form of working that is relatively place independent. And we have seen that, for example, these digital platforms of skilled work have embedded their own platform-based communication systems so that these platform enterprises can monitor communication and profit making. So again, the question for the future, with this kind of work, that's also so one part that's in the literature regarded so as the gig economy, as gig working. Will this become more important? I mean, certainly in the current crisis, we would expect that people who are already quite experienced on these digital platforms probably could rather save their work compared to other self-employed people who have really suffered from this current recession. In general, again, linking back to our first speaker, so wider questions on productivity and home working, and how can new technology really ensure high productivity and home working, for example. I mean, there are a lot of really fascinating questions I could think of. And I mean, certainly the work of the center that you have just started, I mean, you are really, at the forefront of these very interesting questions.
Thank you, Daria. I know you've done work on the interrelationship between personal or home life and work life. And I guess at the moment, most people are working from home. So this is going to be a massive change, that transition from home to work.
I mean, home working, particularly amongst employees, is quite a niche for rather privileged workers. I mean, workers like us who are high skilled in high income jobs, and who have the housing conditions to basically work in their homes, and also the technology to do that. There are huge disadvantage in who actually can or could, before the crisis, work from home. There are quite big gaps between people who could work from home and who actually worked from home. So we need to look at this gap and why some people could work from home but didn't do it before the crisis. So the question is, will they now be more inclined to work from home once they have arranged so set up? But at the same time, because there was this big social gradient involved in teleworking, home working, so the big question for society and then communication researchers like you, so how can we enable people to work from home, which is now obviously a cushioning for losing job income and so on, to make this more available to other jobs, less skilled jobs.
Thank you. Yes, that's lots of questions, which is great. Could we move on now? Anne-Marie, so I know you're from a totally different background. Tell us a bit more about your work and what you are thinking in terms of the future post-COVID.
Hello, everyone. So my research is in the field of rehab technologies, primarily for people that have had a stroke or MS, Parkinson's, anything like that. So in terms of sort of technical development, obviously technical development of technologies can actually go ahead. We're exchanging ideas, but obviously we can't get together to try things out on one another. And certainly we would normally have patient involvement right the way through the development of technologies. And so at the moment, we're not doing that. But in the future, we will be gradually building that in. Obviously, if you are somebody that's had a stroke, there may be a number of different reasons whereby it's difficult to communicate. So you may find it very difficult to actually be able to speak, first of all. You may find it very difficult to understand what somebody's telling you. And then you may also have physical difficulties. So it may be very difficult for you to use a keyboard, for example. And all of those feed into a difficulty in being able to communicate needs or wants for new technologies. And so I think there's a real area in terms of the actual platforms that we're using And I'm sure many of us on this call are struggling a little bit with a number of different platforms we're trying to use at the moment, the differences between them, actually hooking into them, making sure you've got your microphone on, making sure you've got your video on at the appropriate time, turning them off when you don't need them. And if you compound that with a cognitive difficulty or a communication difficulty, it just makes that experience so much more challenging for people. One of the things that I think that we are seeing is a move away in our general lives from text and audio through to video. And certainly it's a new skill to be able to present ourselves well, but also to be able to process that verbal information. It requires sort of different skills to be able to extract what you need from the verbal information as to what you might extract from written information. And I think that that is something that we need to be cognizant of as we go about our research into communication, how it affects different people. I was speaking with some friends recently, and we were talking about video conferencing. And one of their relatives had recently had a stroke with aphasia, so difficulty in being able to find the right words, but is also suffering from a little bit of dementia. And so what was happening in that family was that his wife was only connecting with her family when he was out in the garden, because nobody could actually work out how best to communicate with him over the technology. And so it was leading to exclusion rather than inclusion with this kind of technology, that he would have had more in a face-to-face meeting with his family.
Gosh, yes, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we tend to think of this type of communication as being inclusive, but of course it's not for everybody at all. Thinking about the healthcare field, I guess GPs, healthcare practitioners have been forced to adopt telemedicine options now, remote consultations. Do you think that will remain?
So I think that some elements of that will definitely remain. So I've talked to some speech and language therapist friends of mine who are not actually using remote therapy at the moment with the people that they see. They feel that actually the slight delay that there often is will inhibit their ability to identify speech patterns. And certainly with pediatric patients, a lot will depend upon the carer's ability to keep the child engaged with the remote access conversation, and it will require much more skills from the actual therapist in terms of being able to remotely engage with that particular child. And I think that would be the same for a lot of different patients.
And I guess like Darius said as well, really, we're also reliant on a suitable or a kind of a calm home environment where people can access remote telemedicine services, and that people have the sufficient literacy perhaps to understand exactly what's required from them.
Yes. Another thing I would like to bring up is obviously we're seeing sort of wards full of COVID patients at the moment, and there's been highlighted a real need for sort of methods of communication for people that are in isolation, that can't actually see any of their families, and also for the people that are in personal protective equipment. To be able to better communicate, is there sort of a different means of communication for those people to be able to interact with the people actually on the ward?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some heartbreaking stories in the media, hasn't there, of people visiting their loved ones in their last moments, and there's glass and they're 2 meters away from them, PPE over their face. It's communication really is broken down, isn't it? At that point, we don't have our usual methods of communicating with our loved ones.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Let's carry on with the introduction. So, MC, can you tell us a bit more about your work and how COVID has changed what you're doing?
I don't know that COVID has changed exactly what I'm doing, but in terms of the stuff we're actually looking at for a while now, how to improve virtual teams to be able to get together and work as effectively as co-located teams. Is that possible? What means that they don't? Because the literature is pretty clear that when we are working in these environments, we don't work nearly as well or as effectively, especially if we're putting together new teams, as we do when we're physically co-located. So part of the theory that we've been looking at is that we're actually meant to work together physically, and that different things happen to each other, from our heart rates to our hormone responses when we're in the same room with people, that are just not getting fired up, and if they are, not in the same ways when we're using technology. Here, first speaker was talking about telemedicine from the 90s. This technology that we're using right now is over 30 years old. It was designed for business meetings. And most of us are not trying to have just business meetings. In fact, I would say right now, I don't know why we're using video, because that is just forcing us to maintain positions that have been repeatedly shown to be unhelpful and unhealthy. We're trying to get away from being sedentary and being fixed in front of a screen. And this is why I don't have the video on right now, is that right now I'm trying to do the sort of things that enable me to think more clearly and listen better, which is not staring at a screen. It's actually listening, using the audio channel, moving around while we're chatting, as we would if we were perhaps walking outside together. So as somebody who's working in a lab whose mission is to explore how to make interactive technology make normal better for all, given all the constraints that have already been raised, especially from the gig economy to people working at home. And I would say this is less of an experiment than in prison. I don't disagree with lockdown, but the effects are not just like somebody deciding to work at home. There's a pandemic going on. People are dying. We could die. So there's an unusual amount of stress while we are being asked to perform at sort of a cognitively similar level. And while all of us are being extremely understanding of this, there's also the stress that's impacting us. So our current tools in terms of how we work as human beings and how we work optimally and how we cope with stress are really poorly supported by the tools we have. I mean, some of us have been commenting, wow, isn't it an interesting coincidence that this pandemic is happening when we can still keep some semblance of activity happening because we have this amazing technology of the internet so that we can stay connected to each other in some way. And my concern is, or one of my concerns around this is actually, well, we all know that when we're under stress and trying to make decisions, we rarely make optimal decisions. So that's one thing already working against our capacity to make informed choices and good decisions right now. We all know that when we are in kind of static, stationary, fixed positions, we are not at our best. And most of us are starting to talk about feeling the effects of enforced lack of movement as well. So we're dealing with a lot of physiological challenges right now that just because we can use video, and especially for those of us who can use it, as opposed to even the people who are excluded because they can't or they don't have the bandwidth or there are other issues going on, this really sucks. So this is an opportunity. Also, I'm talking with people who are saying, you know, I'm noticing I'm not having to spend as much time traveling to work, and so my life is feeling a little better, surprisingly, in certain levels. So part of what would be interesting here, I think, is for us to try to take this opportunity to correlate and collate what are the things that are feeling like they're working better, why, and how can we protect that and incorporate that into our cultural practices, and what are the things that are working less well and why, and how might we look at dealing with that. And all of us have dealt with workplace stress and anxiety, but we're feeling that still in different ways now. So when we combine the fact that We are actually probably more sedentary working at home than we have been when we've had to move into a workplace, encounter other people, strangers on the tube, all sorts of things that we need human interaction skills for. When we don't practice those, when we don't use stuff in our bodies, they atrophy. So I'm a little concerned about us celebrating the fact that we can still stay connected when so much of what is important to human connectivity is actually being filtered out by this technology. So I would certainly encourage anybody listening to this, since we're not using video to look at something, that we not use video, that we focus on having some of these meetings more to be audio for our health and well-being. And in fact, if we start to think about, especially with e-learning around the use of video, our lab is thinking about not how we use more video, which causes us to spend more time looking at screens and becoming more myopic or nearsighted, which has been clinically demonstrated now, but to start thinking about how we can design technologies that let us learn by being more human, which is moving more in space. So if we need to do that more at home, that's really interesting, but we need the technology not to get us to fixate on screens and better audio and video quality, but how to support our human practices in the environment. And some of the examples you heard about folks who are recovering from stroke, who are dealing with limitations in their access to these kind of technologies that are really not natural, is, I think, highlighting the need for thinking new thoughts in terms of what communication in the next part of the 21st century needs to be like to respect our very much older wiring than the internet. I'll leave it there.
May I step in, if I may? Because
yes, of course, yes.
I find it very strange that the technology enable us to have much richer, of course not as rich as being together, but much richer option, at least to see the people and to see something about their feeling, about their action, and suddenly people close it and make it like a telephone call. This is not what we should be, and enjoy the technology. And of course, we shouldn't stick our face all the time in front of the screen. But if we meet people the same way that we are meeting them in a place, in a workplace, we would still sit all the time around the table, but we see each other. And here
that's not very natural either. That's not how we were ever wired to connect safely with each other, to have to sit in a fixed space and not move or walk around each other. These are all extremely artificial mechanisms of social convention that have never been shown to be anything except stress-inducing, problematic, and potentially negative for people. We're much better at meeting when we are at liberty to choose our mechanisms of communication. And again, my complaint
in business, we always sit in meetings together in one room. Everybody sit on the chair. So we're not moving around when we have...
Nope, I disagree. That is an old convention. And again, there's a lot of work, and my lab's been engaged with this around exploring, exactly because of the problems associated with sedentary meetings, to get mobile, to find other ways to generate ideas, to communicate, to support the physiology and the neurology of human optimal performance. What we're finding, and what we know from teaching and from learning and so on, is that exactly these positions, including all the other things that go along with it, it's not just sitting in a meeting room, it's also the fact that most people are underslept, who are, their nutrition is poor and are stressed. None of these things are supporting well-being. So I'm just focusing on one piece of it that is being, because that piece is being focused on right now. I'm not saying don't look at each other on a video screen, but I'm saying sitting for 2 hours staring at a camera in a fixed position, probably leaning forward a lot of the time, tells your brain that you're in an unsafe and stressful environment. So whereas standing up, moving around, putting your shoulders back, stretching, tells your brain that you're feeling more comfortable. So until our technology supports our physiology, we are always going to be compromised. And until our cultural conventions, from meetings to work and so on, support our physiology for optimal performance, we are not going to be performing at our healthiest and best.
Can I make a point here?
Oh, yes. Hello. Actually, I was about to move on to you, so that's great. Thank you. Yes.
Great. Thank you. Because hi, I'm Jane. I work in linguistics, and one of the things that I kind of thought about when I looked at the questions for this particular chat that we're having was I kind of looked at it from my own perspective of research and what we already do in linguistics. And Michael, I'm sure you can comment on this as well. My colleague Michael, who's on the conversation as well, because obviously we're having much more online interaction. One of the areas that we have been looking at for years in linguistics is this very, very much this active communication, things like turn taking. You know, it is really difficult in digital communication such as we're having now. Somebody wants to say something, you raise your hand, but not everybody can see you do that, and it can be quite frustrating when you have a meeting online to be able to take your turn, to wait for your turn. It's difficult to be what we call a cooperative conversationalist. It's very difficult. You want to make a point, there's a lag in the signal, the technology doesn't quite catch up. So at all times you're feeling, I quite agree with the speaker, that you feel frustrated. You end up it's particularly on video, because you do feel as though you should sit and engage with the screen. And that's another big issue, because we are, with video, we are having to rely very much more on non-verbal cues of communication rather than verbal ones, because there are issues with quality of speech. Often we get high frequency hiss in the background. We're struggling to see sometimes people's visemes, the expressions, but so we end up talking like this, which for a lot of people, and it is a cultural thing obviously, but for a lot of people it's very alien to them to have so many visual cues going on at the same time. I mean, particularly, I'm thinking of a conversation I tried to have with my cousin the other day via Skype. And I know that this is something that links into the kind of the digital technology that the centre is going to kind of think about for the future. But he is deaf. He is profoundly deaf. And it was very, very difficult for him. He couldn't, my face was blurred. He couldn't focus on the visemes. The low frequency noises that were coming through weren't sufficient for him to be able to understand what I was saying. And in the end, he just gave up. Okay. All these issues make for a very frustrating time. And I think a lot of people, my family, other people's families, my friends, were all having issues with online interaction. We think it's this great kind of way of keeping in touch, but actually it can be very, very frustrating to the act of communication. There's also this issue, of course, of virtual space. A lot of the time, and I've noticed this a lot in interactions with friends online, we end up becoming much more formal. Our style of speech changes. All these things are areas that have been looked at, or are starting to be looked at more and more in our department in various PhD research, etc. But it's become very, very clear to me that this is something, you know, the situation we're in right now has exacerbated this. And it's not only online. I've noticed differences with communication. It's where you actually meet somebody face to face. You know, if you go for a walk, where we are maintaining social distance, the level of personal space around us has increased dramatically, and we do feel quite threatened. There are these almost face threatening, but these threatening acts to our own space, and communication becomes much more reliant on nonverbal cues. I mean, I don't know if any of you have experienced this. I live in the woods for my sins, and there are so many people walking in the woods, and it's very much we rely on nonverbal cues, hello, body positioning, turning our bodies away when somebody goes past, if they're running or if they're on a bike, because of course people are worried about things like speech droplets, water droplets. But also from a positive point of view, people are starting to nod at each other more, to say hello, to okay, they're putting barriers up to limit conversation and communication to formulaic types of interaction, but people are recognizing, I suppose, as an act of communication, that we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same situation. And all these areas are areas that we in linguistics are very, very interested in. And I guess I would hope that when all this is over, this will kind of stimulate more interest in the way we interact, not only online, but the way we interact with people face to face. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that, but I mean,
thank you, Jane.
Sorry, go on.
No, thank you. I was just going to ask if Michael wanted to step in now.
Yes.
I know he's a linguistics specialist as well. Michael,
Okay.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us your thoughts?
Yeah, Michael Kranert. I'm a discourse analyst. Discourse is one of these elusive terms that has more than one meaning, and therefore I'm actually in this crisis interested in more than one area of communication. One is indeed the sort of interactional thing that Jane was already talking about, and the whole experience of working online that we've discussed so far already. And one thing that I was thinking about is that this online type of communication only allows for one channel of communication in terms of only the front stage, only what you present to the group, and then you turn your microphone off, and what happens afterwards, for example, is not existent. Or what happens between smaller groups in a group is not existent. So if you think about a meeting normally starts, and before it starts, you speak to somebody you speak to somebody else, then it goes into the meeting and you have the front stage, but still you have little side conversations where you ask other people. Then normally when the meeting disappears, when it's ended, the formal part is ended, still you form smaller groups and you talk to somebody and say, look, what we've talked about just in the meeting, I'm not quite sure how to handle this, or I haven't got all the information. So a lot of work and a lot of organizational work happens backstage, happens in a more private space. And I'm I'm not worried. I'm wondering how this is going to work when you do online communication. On the other hand,
can I just ask, you must be familiar with Slack and such technologies that are designed for back channeling support during meetings.
No, sadly I'm not. I'm just learning how to use all this stuff. Although I'm normally quite tech savvy, I try to keep it low profile because I'm already struggling with the various technologies that we have in the house, i.e. paper, books, readers, videos, and then suddenly having to use all these online things is getting... so I have not used Slack, but I've heard that. The trouble with that is obviously you have to learn to use the technology first. So you're not only... Normally we do these things naturally. We don't have to think about them. We just do this.
Well, come on now. There's cultural practices around every part of our communication that have to be learned and reinforced and practiced, as we were talking about earlier. So I'm not sure what natural means here.
Oh, no, yeah. Of course, if you want to have that conversation about natural, but yeah, no, okay. So it's a new, and I'm not negative about it or pessimistic about it. I'm just saying what I can see at the moment is there's a lot of learning happening, and I'm sure we'll solve that. And if you say Slack, I haven't looked into that, has that ability, that is great. But I can see in my online teaching at the moment, I can see this in other online meetings, there's a lot of learning going on, and trying to understand how does the technology work, what does it allow me, and that actually interestingly has a positive effect that there's much more reflection going on and much more transparency in many situations about how we communicate. So when we've organized a big seminar with over 100 people, and we had to really set out, these are the ground rules that we want to follow, this is what you do best, and we had to show people. And quite often we don't do that, we just implicitly believe we know how it works. So there's a flip side to this. So that's one side that I'm interested in, but there's another completely other side that we haven't talked about. I'm actually interested in public discourse and in political discourse. And I find that very interesting at the moment, how this whole expert-lay communication in terms of risk works, and how politicians suddenly returned to the experts that we've just banished, that they have just banished before, and said, who wants to listen to experts? And I'm very much interested in a new focus on global risk and health risk, and how politicians try to translate into action what scientists tell them, and how that actually exactly works, and how they quote them, and which parts they take into account, and how experts are constructed. So that's a completely different sort of part to what we talked about, and that is quite relevant to different political cultures as well. So it happens very differently in Germany to the UK, or even the US. I mean, we were all surprised when we saw Trump's comment on drinking bleach, but if you know a bit more about, or injecting bleach, but if you know a bit more about some of the power structures and religious background things that happen in the US, it's not as difficult to understand where that was coming from. It's not as surprising, which I didn't know.
Sorry. Jane, did you want to step in there? Your hand.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. I do apologise.
I think I'm quite echoing. I'm not sure why. Raise your hand.
If everybody who's not talking could mute their mic, that will get rid of the echo.
Jane, I think you raised your hand. Did you, as Michael was talking? No, you didn't. No. Oh, perhaps. I have done that in a meeting this week, and I was just scratching my head, and everybody waited for me to say something very wise, and then nothing was forthcoming, unfortunately. So I guess in a way I've been thinking about this time as perhaps leveling the playing field for communication. I mean, I'm thinking about me personally. I'm now FaceTiming friends that live in California exactly the same as I would FaceTime a friend that lived in Southampton. And my family lives quite far away, but now suddenly we're all on a level playing field. And I've quite enjoyed that. But I think in terms of inclusivity, there are going to be a lot of issues, really. So, Jane, do you think the online forum helps with inclusivity, or hinders it, or a little bit of both?
I think it has its positive side, and I think it has its negative side. I think if you're a teenager, and as we well know, the younger generation already engage far more online than we do, and have been for some years now. In fact, there are a substantial number of I say teenagers, it's probably being a bit too general, but there are a number of people who do prefer online communication than face-to-face communication. whether it has a degree of it can be a positive thing and a negative thing. And you think about, we all know the stories of teenagers who are ostracized by their peers because of various comments on Instagram or Twitter or whatever these platforms are. But there is I have a 15-year-old daughter who feels very much part of a group, part of a network, feels inclusive, feels connected with her peers because she is online, because she has the ability to communicate online, to every day, to engage with her friends, and with her boyfriend, and with all the people who she would be engaging with were she still attending school. That is just an extension, really, of what she was already doing, but it's become something that's she now engages with these people online every single day. For her, it's been a lifeline, because where we are very isolated. She couldn't even if it were allowed, she wouldn't be able to see people very easily because of where we live. We are very, very isolated. But for her, it's been a lifeline, because I think without this, and I'm sure this is the case for many, many young people in particular, and people in their 20s and 30s and etc. I think if they didn't have the ability to connect online, then they would be very, very isolated. They'd have no social interaction.
Can we talk about that for a second?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So I had a post a while ago saying, I'm trying to find it, about, online social media communication is like the refined sugar of communication, because it takes all of the tough stuff, all of the fiber, if you will, out of communication. And so while I hear what you're saying and can agree that there's lots of benefit to having access to online communication, to being able to participate in social media and so on, outside of the downsides of being bullied, the question we might want to be asking is, how are we leveraging that to help people build the skills that are necessary to engage better when in personal contact with somebody, when in a face-to-face experience with somebody? Because if people only feel safe and capable of communicating with others when they have that screen between them, then I don't think we're building really healthy human beings here, or good cultures.
Totally, yeah, I would totally agree with you. I mean, I am a nagging mother about online time. I totally agree with you. But I think we are in a very, as people keep saying, interesting times. And I think at this precise moment, I think the fact that people have this facility to keep in touch, and I think particularly for young people who, my daughter struggled a lot when school stopped, and she isn't the only one. I know of lots and lots of people who immediately their daily contact with people, face-to-face contact, was stopped overnight. And that's very, very, I mean, I'm on research leave. I was working from home anyway. For me, it's not that different. Okay. But for her, that was incredibly difficult. And there are, plenty of stories out there where people have been really, really struggling with that just day-to-day interaction, where you just exchange pleasantries even. Now, I totally agree. I worry greatly. What I worry about is when we come out of this, and I think this is probably what you're saying, is that a great number of people are going to struggle with face-to-face interaction, that they're going back to a degree of what we thought of as normal. The younger generation will they just simply continue to engage more online as a social choice? I mean, at the moment it's almost enforced on them, but afterwards, is it just going to be, well, I won't bother meeting my mates because I don't need to. I can contact them online. I don't know. I still think there's, my daughter's very socially well adjusted, but I can't talk for other people. But she, certainly, I think it's definitely an issue. I don't know if anybody else has anything to comment on this. It would be interesting to see whether this level of engagement online and the way that there are these almost artificial conversations that go on, particularly on things like Instagram, that, there's snatches of conversations, their comments, their pictures, and that's it, it's gone. And you're on to the next one. That's not engaging in a one-to-one conversation with somebody as you would do face-to-face. Be interesting to see whether that does have a huge effect on the way people interact in the future.
Ruby, I'm going to bring you back in here. So things are perhaps never going to be the same, or certainly not going to be like they have been for a very, very good while. So in terms of your field, film and entertainment, lots of things are missing. And how can we begin really to understand what is missing in terms of entertainment for streaming at home versus going to the movie theatres? And as far as I can see, really, movie theatres is going to be one of the last things perhaps to come in.
I believe that there is a big impact on how people in general are going to have their entertainment in the near future. Again, because we can't actually go to cinemas these days. And one of the reasons why audiences would still like to go to the cinema is for the communal experience that they get there. So unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we can't go to cinemas, we can't actually go to or attend any film festivals. Most of the major international film festivals have been cancelled, and that actually affect a lot of the downstream development, so to speak, of the whole life cycle of film, the value chain that we are looking at when we discuss film exhibition in particular. In terms of choices of film, there are currently still a lot of them available online through various kind of video on demand platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, or even the art house platform Mubi. But we don't know how long it will actually take these platforms to work like what we used to have with cinemas on the one hand. So these platforms sometimes, before the pandemic, they would provide that kind of opportunities for people who would like to stay at home and see films in their own time. But now everybody basically is forced to stay home to watch films if they really would like to continue watching films. So there is a big unknown there. We don't know what will happen even in the next few months, because there is a big disruption in terms of work, in terms of production, distribution, and also exhibition of films in almost all the film industries on Earth. So we will have to see what will happen.
I guess really the communal experience that we get from going to the movie theatre, seeing an exciting new film, that can't be recreated really. So we're definitely losing that. I mean, I guess you can, well, I've never done it, but my daughter tells me you can like start a Netflix party and watch a Netflix show with other people. And I guess you can live chat with people. I mean, perhaps you can chat with people a bit more when you're watching a film at home than you could obviously at the movie theatre. But in terms of the communal experience.
Well, that's interesting that you raised that, because this is pushing on questions again. Before COVID happened, this is a thing that our lab was really focused on, was what makes virtual teams at such a disadvantage from physical teams. And part of I'm not sure that we could replicate it. In fact, we were looking at this for the National Space Group, for people who are in isolation in space, is what's going on physiologically. Can we emulate that a little bit better so that we can support exactly the kind of communal experience that Ruby says is so important? For some reason, it's become the way we've evolved is to have these social experiences together, to have social catharsis together, why eating together is so important. And the goal is not to replace that, but can we think about, at least from our side, designing tools, not just screens and audio? Somebody mentioned we only have one channel, like the front channel, is how do we support more of these channels if we have to do things at more of a distance? One of the things you talked about is that we're all on a level playing field now. Well, except for time zones, that hasn't quite shifted. If we could flatten out the earth, we would get there. But assuming that we're on this time shifted space, but we're using these technologies, the other part of the level playing field is the how poor a channel it is for the richness we've been talking about. So we're interested in, can you do things like what happens when you are able to move around more in meetings, when you're moving more? I'm noticing your work during this whole call has been to nod and look at people when we're talking, like you are carrying the social burden of this meeting because of all the facial cues that you're giving to us to show support. And when you look at the rest of us, we're not nearly as on as you are with your face right in the camera as close as you can be to simulating that.
Pick it up, guys. Come on, let's have more social cues. Don't
well, so
May
again,
I ask you, Mrs. MC, yes, this is really disturbing because you get the cues, you get something from Helen, but we cannot see anything from you. You are hiding behind your microphone.
Well, you can call it hiding if you want, and that's kind of
to share with us, and you refuse, and this is really unkind.
Well, I think that's bullshit for you to call it unkind. It's my choice because I might not feel really comfortable with that, and I value my well-being.
You use profanity. I use proper language, you use profanity. Be careful.
Yep, I sure did. I'm Canadian. We come from the heart. We don't hide that. I think that that is
from the heart, but I don't use profanity in the talking.
Well, good. So more judgment on me. Fantastic. Thank you.
Indeed, yes.
Okay, guys, let's just move it along a little bit. So Barak, let's what else would you like to say about this? So I think in a way I do well seeing people's faces as well, and I think perhaps for me, I'm used to working with people with severe to profound hearing impairment, and for that everything is in the face. So speech reading is reading the whole face. Well, body language obviously is lost, but at least you can read people's faces. So for me, I do perhaps do a little bit better seeing people's faces, but I guess this is a big difference now that we have the choice, don't we? We have the choice and the freedom to show our faces, to be walking around. And I guess what MC is saying really is this is how we work as humans. So as humans, we're not really designed to be sat like this, staring at the screen. So even a traditional work meeting, we're not really designed for that. Perhaps we do better moving around. Do you want to?
Well, it depends on the type of, and I don't mean to jam the channel here, so I'll just share this and back away. But what we're finding is it depends on the type of work or communication that we're doing. So, for instance, having a conversation like this for me and my current skill level, it's much easier for me to listen and talk and move than to try to watch and stand still at the same time. Also, we're seeing that different types of cognitive processes, so brainstorming lends itself brilliantly to walking around, whereas if we were focused on solving an algorithmic problem, we might want to stay stuck in one place and look at a whiteboard and be sharing a whiteboard instead of our faces. So there's what this is highlighting is that there are different types of tools and channels that we use for different types of work and different types of postures that support different types of interaction. And right now, our tools only give us audio and video. And so that's pretty poor relative to the whole range of dynamics that we use in communication.
So, tell us about this in a business situation, really. What are your thoughts about this? And of course, in our current COVID situation.
Definitely, I agree with MC. There are different channels that are better for different elements. Sometimes email is great because things are written, and sometimes phone call is great. Of course, for most situations, it is better to be, we are social animals. We should be together, we should listen, feel, be aware of the space between us and all that. But now we cannot. So what is the best? Just to isolate ourselves or to hide behind the empty screens, or at least share the video to see that we can look at each other? And I know, I agree, it is more demanding, it is stressing in a way, but it is better for communication than, because we can use the richness of the media. It is just one tool, we don't have to do it. Actually, today I used the phone to call a colleague for something I wanted to speak with him on the phone. So we have a variety, we need to use best. And I hope that very soon we will be back, that our politicians will be brave enough to uplift this lockdown that caused a lot of trouble to many people. And just for many political reasons, they don't do it because they don't have the guts.
Thank you so much, Baruch. Now we've got two raised hands. So Michael and Daria. Michael, can we start with you? And actually, if people want to raise their hands, you can just click on the screen on the bottom left. Michael.
Yeah, I want to go a tiny bit back, but want to connect this to what the conversation is now. When Jane talked about sort of kids using online media more to communicate and what would happen when we come out of this, and my thinking was, I find it really important to remember that this group behavior and communicating in groups and picking up cues from different angles of the room is something that is also a learned behavior, and that children and our students have to learn. I mean, I find in the classroom that a lot of my work as a seminar teacher is to remind them, can you please pick up what others have said, to rephrase, to bring them together. And they get better at this, I often find, as the term goes on. And I think it's from that perspective, it's quite important to insist in the future that we don't move too much learning online, because there seems to be now a move to say, oh, well, you know, it's working so well, why don't we do more of this, and the university can make loads of money with this. And I think it is sometimes for some types of communications, it is essential to be actually in the same room, to be able to decide who are you going to speak to. Are you going to speak to the whole group? Are you able to interact? And a lot of what we do in the classroom, when we don't do teaching from the front, but when we do group work and mixing groups, is exactly that people can reinstate communications themselves, that they can reconnect with other people without sort of one person having to guide that conversation. And I think what I've sort of tried to sketch out here from a point of view of communication in the classroom is applicable to communication in the boardroom, i.e. communication in business. Sometimes it's not what is happening just in that conversation in the big room, but it's also having the intermittent contacts that happen, and also being in the same building when we work. I mean, I find that a lot of our organizational stuff happens, as I tend to call it, using Goffman's, backstage. You know, it's not what happens in the meeting, it's what happens when you meet somebody in the corridor later and say, by the way, you know what we talked about the other day, have you found this document? Or so I think sometimes we forget that space and being in the same space also has a place in communication and a necessity.
This makes me think a little bit about, so as I say, I work with adults and children who have a severe to profound deafness. And when a child is born deaf, they use hearing aids or a cochlear implant, they have lots and lots of face-to-face therapy from their teachers, from speech and language therapists, from their parents. But actually, what we find, what they miss out on really is the backroom communication. So I think it's something like 90% of things we learn as a child is overhearing. So hearing how does my mum communicate with my dad? How does my friend communicate with the teacher? That's how you learn so much about communication. And I guess that backroom stuff is kind of a similar analogy. Now I'm just going to move on to Daria.
Can I just respond briefly to that? Because I wanted to reinforce that. I'm also interested in multilingualism, and as my children are multilingual, and we teach this and we do research into this, and I have the same experience that children pick up a lot of communication habits down to the words and phrases by what they hear, not in direct communication, but sometimes when they see how the parents communicate. And again, that is essential for our students, because they observe others communicate in the classroom and think, oh yeah, I could do the same. And the same is also true for business communication in terms of sort of forming what we call communities of practice, observing what others are doing, the implicit rules of the game and how we communicate and how it's best to work out strategies to collaborate. And I think we are losing that online, or we possibly have to reinvent that or redevelop that online. As MC said, there's nothing natural about this, but it will take time also to learn that.
I think, what you're saying as well is just because you can do it online doesn't mean necessarily it's the right thing to do in future. I think I sometimes feel a bit perhaps giddy with excitement that, oh, nothing's changed for me. My whole world is still here online. I can do everything online. But actually what we need to be thinking about is what is lost from that. Daria, you've had your hand raised for a while. Over to you. Daria, have we lost you? I think you might be muted still. Here we go. Just make sure you're not on mute. Daria, we're not picking you up at the moment. So I think Anne-Marie, you've got your hand raised as well. So could we hear from Anne-Marie and then go back to you, Daria, if that's okay?
Yeah, so I was going to go back to the point where we were talking about the diversity of people that we interact with, and just generally what I'm missing is interaction more with strangers and people that you would come across but wouldn't necessarily know within your circle. So just in terms of the communication that I have now is nearly only with people that I know, or very brief hello across the street. There's no actual sort of meeting of new people coming through in the same volume that I would have done before. And also a lot of the ad hoc meeting, as other people have said. So it's more difficult to get information about what is actually going on in an organization. So because you're not linked into so many networks, you're just linked into a few primary networks. So you don't get the other sort of streams of information coming through, which is, it's less satisfying as a means of communication for me.
Agreed.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So your mum obviously never told you not to speak to strangers. So that's what you're missing at the moment, the stranger communication. I do know what you mean. Daria, have you managed to unmute your microphone? So if you just wiggle your mouse around a little bit, you should see the microphone at the bottom, and you can just click it on or off, or press M on the keyboard, and I think that will mute and unmute you. No, I think we're struggling, Daria, to get you, although you don't seem to be muted.
Daria, I unmuted the video. She stopped the video, so maybe you can unmute her as the organizer of the meeting. Here she is.
Oh, here we go. Daria, we're still not hearing you, unfortunately. We can see you. We've still got you muted, perhaps. Okay, well, let's come back to you, Daria. Hopefully you can maybe...
Just a quickie is you might want to reconnect and check what mic your computer thinks it's using, because sometimes that can get switched around, and so the system's no longer picking up your mic.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you, MC. That's great. So just thinking really about another question, really. So longer term, because of what's happened in the pandemic, what changes do you think might persist, and what attitudes will change? So for me, I work in telehealth for people with cochlear implants, and I've spent a long time really in the past talking to people about remote care for patients and how it could work, how it could empower patients to manage their own healthcare at home. And now, all of a sudden, clinician attitudes have changed, and everybody is very, very keen to facilitate digital health because we've had to. And I'm just interested really whether this will persist. What do people think? Anne-Marie, why don't you start us off on this?
So I think that video communication, despite what everybody thinks, is going to continue for the moment. And I think we'll largely, in terms of education, we'll largely have groups online, and there'll still be a lot of social groups online. So particularly, as you said, the equalisation. So groups in sort of New Zealand are suddenly as local to us as groups in, an hour's drive away. So I think those will keep going online. I think obviously we've had a lot of discussions about conferences and, what's going to happen with conferences. So I'm involved with a rehab technologies conference that normally sort of meets every couple of years. And we've had a lot of discussion about whether we delay it, whether it all goes online, or whether we just cancel it completely. And it's not clear yet what we're actually doing, because some of the companies that support this are, making big redundancies. So, there's a lot of sort of change going on in the sector. I think that one of the big things that I see is that there will be more flexibility. So traditionally, a lot of people haven't been able to work at home, and because the companies are seeing that actually productivity, people are still working even though they're at home, I think that people will have more confidence that their employees will be still delivering on targets, albeit working at whatever time is most suitable for them within their lives. I think that the problems with the technology that we're seeing, and that isn't going to change overnight. It's still difficult for people to access, for people with disabilities. I suppose one of the things depends. I mean, we're talking about after the pandemic, but when that's making an assumption, because we don't know that we're not going to have to just live with this, and it's not going to keep coming back annually like the flu, and when we're going to have the vaccine at all. So a lot depends, I think, on how quickly we can resume face to face, and how entrenched we become in working. So at the moment, it's still very, very tiring for all of us, because we're trying to learn so much new stuff. But as that becomes more and more normal way of working, then perhaps we will find it more relaxing, and we feel more confident in just being able to turn off the video and stand up and do a few exercises, as MC was saying, and then just come back to a meeting, and just because we've not been able to do that in face-to-face meetings. But actually it's maybe this permission has now been granted, and we can just relax into it a little bit more.
So that's going to be a good thing, really, if we are responding more to our physiology. And like you say, we couldn't do this before. I mean, it was great to be face to face, but it would generally be frowned on if you would kind of stand up and do like a Pilates routine in a meeting. But
you just couldn't do it, could you?
We can do that now.
Yes.
Daria, we have you back. I'm well done for
sorting out the
microphone. Thank you, MC, for the top tip. So let's move over to Daria.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I just locked off. Well, digital technology. Okay, so I enjoyed listening to areas that are obviously outside my own research expertise. And even though we talk quite a bit about proximity and physical proximity, which is quite spatial of sort, what I want to maybe raise as well, which is now so important, which has changed so much for COVID and thinking about the future, is the impact on transport, the impact on city life, the impact on environmental issues. I mean, interestingly, so now countries and cities that try to relax social distancing have connected this to new new means of how we move around in cities, limiting the speed cars can drive through cities, but also introducing, trying to facilitate more cycling in cities. I mean, I thought that this was slightly, this is an important issue related to digital communication as well, which is good to discuss.
Thank you, Daria. Yes, I mean, in fact, are we going to come out of this pandemic, if we do come out of it, as you say? Are we going to come out of it having developed new skills, new trust with our managers at work, new ways of accessing entertainment? Have we all been kind of forced to make the leap that we were going to make anyway, gradually in 5 to 10 years' time? Are there going to be some things that are very, very positive?
If I may, definitely.
Yes.
Because one of the things that I pointed out first is the issue of trust. And the things that prevented many employers to allow working from home was lack of trust. And in a culture where you can judge people by results, if you have trust in the people that they do the work, even though they're at home and you don't watch them all the time, then this is great. Again, it will be much better, and I really look forward to the day that we will be back to normal. It will never be normal as before. It will be changed. There will be new things. People will realize other options, and people will be able to accommodate working from home. That is, of course, good to the environment, less pollution, and other very positive elements. And yes, working from home enables to many disabled people that otherwise wouldn't be able to work at all. Suddenly they can do it. So there are many ways that the ability to communicate from home or from any other place is offering many new opportunities that management should learn and adapt to. That's it.
Thank you. Michael, you've got your hand raised, please.
I was just thinking, as much as I like the opportunity for change now, which is a good thing, I think we all need to be aware that this change needs to be renegotiated, and we need to be very careful about what is going to happen here. So how much are we moving online, and are we forgetting certain things that should not or could not be done online? I mean, I always think about the working environment. I mean, I've been in academia for a while, and in different institutions there are different rules about how much you work from home. And since I arrived in Southampton, I've worked quite a lot from home, and what came out of that is less informal contact, less conversations that you wouldn't normally have. The trouble with a lot of from home working and online communication is all that communication is almost planned. Yeah, you have to set, okay, we're going to meet on Jitsi or Microsoft Teams. But what tends to happen quite often in working environments where we meet are the accidental meets that lead to collaboration that wasn't originally intended or planned. Now, I'm saying this just for the work environment, but that has other impacts. For example, if you think about conferences, I had quite a lot of conversations at the moment about academic conferences. Oh, that can all move online and should move online also in terms of us going carbon neutral, which I totally agree with. And I do understand the need for traveling less. But again, as we all know from the unconference movement or methods, a lot of what happens at a conference is not us sitting in that planned paper, is what's happening in the pub afterwards. It's the people that you bump into accidentally. And I think somebody said it before, we meet less people that we don't know. And I think quite often going somewhere is also an opportunity to have new input. So again, renegotiating whether do we move all academic conferences online? Do we move, or most of them, do we move a lot of work online? What are we losing when we're doing this?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about conferences, aren't you? That to me, almost, that's where I get my benefit from conferences. You know, I can read the abstracts and the papers ahead of the conference, even. I can, you know, read the papers afterwards. But perhaps for me, most of the benefit is bumping into somebody when we're kind of struggling with the salad tongs at lunchtime and kind of saying, so, you know, what is your field, and finding some kind of commonality, and, oh gosh, you work in this area, my colleague. So that is lost. And how can we ever kind of have that stranger communication again, really, if we do conferences online? That, I don't know. We may as well just read the journal articles.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. But that's the issue in many areas. You can sort of translate that into the work environment, into the learning environment, into our private lives. Is that input that we didn't expect, that unexpected input, and also the time that is free of planned communication. That salad bar example that you gave, or the cafeteria, you sit in the cafeteria at work and bump into somebody who's coming with somebody else and saying, oh, can we join you? And you have a conversation that wasn't planned, that was spontaneous.
MC, over to you. You've raised your hand.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'm coming back to your question about, what is going to be kept, what can be changed, and hearing what Michael's saying about negotiation. I think that's really important all the time. So much of this about working from home, we've been here before. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution or pre-Industrial Revolution, everybody was working from home. So it's like, boy, talk about plus échange. And so we have a lot of historical precedents to look at. What are the advantages and disadvantages of working in your own little cottage versus going to the factory? One of the things that's been really interesting, though, and amazing about this experience is how frequently the people you would not ever hear asking this before are now asking, how are you doing? What can we do for your well-being? Your well-being is more important to us than your grant or your teaching or anything else. And that would be something really interesting to hang on to, because, as I said, we've got a global pandemic going on. So yes, please let's acknowledge that we're all stressed out by the potential negative side effects of this. But work is also historically established to be really stressful. 80% of workers surveyed in the States a few years ago were asked what if they were stressed, and they all reported on high levels. It's 80%. So maybe asking how we're doing as a regular part of our communication and really meaning it should be and could be really important. The other thing that's really frustrating about this is all the questions you're asking about conferences and interaction are, and Richard could probably point to this as well, is that these have been questions that have been asked in computer-supported cooperative work for almost 30 years. And we have made zero progress, well, really it's trivial progress on this, which is amazing. So maybe this is the kind of forcing function it needs to say, what are we really doing with these technologies and how we meet? And as for stranger meetings, these happen on Twitter all the time. So we do have examples of total strangers yelling at each other and carrying on polemics with each other. And it's really not often very positive, but sometimes it can be. So maybe we have models there of how do you take some of that kind of stranger interaction and build that more into online spaces. But another concern or thought of going forward is, you talk about how important it is to see one's face, and I get that, and we all see cultures where, especially for women, not seeing your face is a thing. And it's interesting, the discussion around masks, if effectively we're creating a sort of sense of social condom right now for social interaction, social discourse, social intercourse, if you will. And so what are the levels at which we will disclose ourselves, and how do we connect? So I'm just raising some questions that are coming forward from this, and that I hope is, to use Michael's term, that we continue to negotiate explicitly. And one of the things I would like to see negotiated explicitly, and I think, Helen, you touched on this too, is what are the new norms that we would like to bring into this? If we feel happier moving around while we're talking to people, maybe we should burn the chairs and the tables for a while. Maybe that should, these experiments have been going on, but maybe we should embrace them. Maybe we should figure out why we're only asking now at the levels of leadership. How are you doing, as something that, I think that's the most profound one for me, is that this level at which all of our organizational principles are actually asking us, how are we doing? And that we're supposed to therefore have some mechanism to respond to that. So that's one of the negotiations I would like to see. And Helen, again, I just want to celebrate your work in this call and your positivity and your face. And you must be able to sleep so well at night from the work that you're doing for real people. So thank you.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm so happy that you've said I'm showing a nice communicative face. I'm very flattered. Jane, you were also showing a nice communicative face, and you were nodding along a lot when MC was talking.
I agree with her.
Yeah. Tell us more.
I think this issue of well-being is really, really important, and I've noticed it as well. I've noticed this kind of ongoing conversation, if you will, certainly on email, etc., of how are people doing. We must ensure that people are well, that they're coping, etc., etc. And I would endorse that continuing, because I think there can be positives coming out of this. And I think if that were one of the positives that came out of the whole situation that we're in right now, then it would be a worthwhile step. I think as well, one of the things I was thinking about that might change to do with communication longer term was, or perhaps things to do with attitude, how attitudes may change. I would hope, I don't know whether I'm optimistic about this, but I would really hope that people recognize the value of social interaction, social engagement, that they recognize the importance of being able to interact with others, meet up with people, have a conversation. There's a degree of cultural difference in this as well. I have a lot of friends who are Brazilian, Spanish, etc. And I've spoken to a lot of our students who are who have friends from similar nationalities. And one of the things that we've all kind of noticed is this kind of, we can't give you a hug, we can't hold your hand. This social distancing is impeding our norms when it comes to general communication, these kind of, what I called earlier really, these kind of formulaic gestures that we have. And I'm a person who talks with their hands very much normally, so I'm not really emphasizing, perhaps I'm emphasizing it a little bit right now, but all these different kind of norms that we have and these customs that we have that are having to change, that we're trying, we can't communicate. I'm not communicating very well right now, but we can't communicate when we meet people in the street. I'm a climber. I do a lot of rock climbing, and I can't go climbing at the moment. I can't engage with my friends who are climbers. They are very, very emotional, generally very emotional people. We are all very tactile people. I saw somebody the other day in the street, and it was a case of we can't go near each other, and it's all these gestures that we have. stay back. And I would hope people recognise at the end of all this how valuable it is to be able to go up to somebody and shake their hand, to pat them on the shoulder, to engage with them in a not within a restricted personal space, but be able to engage with them face to face, to actually be able to look somebody in the eye and talk to them and smile. And it's whatever we think, it's not the same online. We can try to emulate it, but it is, as MC said earlier, and as Michael agreed with, as others have said, it isn't natural. And I think this is the thing that we have to really hold on to. Whatever we do in the future, whatever leaps and bounds in technology come out, and I know Stefan and I know other people are working on digital technology research and development, but whatever happens, it can't replace that kind of face-to-face communication. That's my thoughts anyway.
Thank you, Michael.
I just wanted to briefly come back to MC's comment on the management asking how we are, which I find an important thing, but almost find it fits into my argument, because I think that question, I'm not sure whether that question, how real that question is and how much they want to hear the answer. And what I found is there's the public communication of how is everybody, and we need to make sure we watch everybody's welfare, and it's in all the documents. But what's actually happening at the same time is a disconcern for people working from home and for people's well-being. So I'm not quite sure. Just as an example of the last sort of weeks of communication that came from the university and swamped us, you know, it's always started off with it should be for the welfare of our students and our staff, and there were quite a few situations I felt where that wasn't embedded, and the trouble was we weren't in the same place. We didn't have the chains of informal communication that normally happen. So I knock next door and say, look, I just saw that email. Did you think that's annoying? Oh yeah, that's annoying. Or did you think that was necessary? And then that's fed back, but it needs an email, and that email is then already a formal piece of communication. You know, you make something in writing. You can't have that informal communication of your anger, or sometimes actually go and say, I found that really frustrating, and then you hear the backstory, and they're saying, well, actually, it wasn't meant that way. What was meant was, because we are all stressed out about the situation, and we all have to rethink how we're doing this teaching. So asking for our welfare is, again, something that needs almost a closer and less planned communication sometimes, and back channeling that we have at the moment. And I found that really frustrating, that I had to actually sit down and write an email and put it in writing and say, look, I'm not happy with what just happened here. And only then the communication started, and had to start big style, sort of saying, no, that's not what we meant, that's not what we did. And to think, well, that could have all been avoided. And how do we normally avoid it? Well, we normally avoid it by not making a fuss, by just having that as a side conversation, and then realizing, okay. Because sometimes it's not the words we say, it's what actually is behind there, and what were the issues behind there, the background, the context that we need to understand. So it's slightly more complicated with that. Yeah, so finding out how people are is not often the public and open question how people are, but also having the chance to communicate through informal channels what is going on and how people feel.
Yeah, and MC, you've just mentioned there on the text chat at the side. So you're right that it's very different, and I think perhaps Anne-Marie, you had said that earlier. It's perhaps very different what I might say to somebody rather than what I might message to them on Teams or by email. So MC, you mentioned Snapchat, of course, that the teenagers use, well, I think mostly teenagers, where the messages disappear, and perhaps we would communicate a little bit differently if we didn't see it as like the server keeping everything we've ever messaged for the last 20 years. Now, we have got about 20 minutes left. I know Daria and Ruby have had to leave, unfortunately. We are academics, and at the moment, the changes that are happening really, I feel, are perhaps being led by Microsoft, Teams, Zoom, Apple, and perhaps we want to be leading those changes a little bit more. So let's start thinking of some research questions. So this is our new world. What do we need to be measuring? What do we need to be monitoring? MC, let's start with you on that one. Let's have a research question.
Well, really, I'd like to understand more about how we can possibly design tools to better support our humanity, which is kind of an ironic position to be in. But technology doesn't always require batteries. You've probably got really technical running shoes or very cool kitchen appliances. It's all sorts of technology that we use to improve certain qualities of our life. And effectively, I think what we're talking about is evolving technologies so that they become more transparent. I'm really moved by the context of people who are disadvantaged from being able to access technology, even though it's right in front of them. It's so complex, or the screens are so shite in terms of what their vision can do, that they become disenfranchised. So if we are able to make our technology more transparent, more supportive of how we work, and that are also in terms of how we support better cultural practices, whether we're face-to-face or using technology, so that we can perform at our best. And as I'm not sure who was mentioning this, might have been Michael, talking about people who are working at home and at work, and people finding out that it's okay to be at home and working. Actually, you were talking about, who was talking about trust?
That was Baruch, I think.
Yeah, that and that's really awesome. So being able to more deliberately surface up issues around, what are our questions, our social questions? Are they about trust? And even Michael is just saying, I don't know if I really believe what people are saying about well-being. That might just be messaging. That could be the case. And so this is a real opportunity. So for me, it's transparent technology that supports not the status quo, but understanding how we perform at our best, which might be moving around, which might be walking, which might be different ways of interacting with each other. Also, Anne-Marie, I think, was mentioning about the sensuality of our communication. We're missing all sorts of different smells that we'd have over dinner with people. And that's an important part of information gathering and feeling safe and building trust. God, the oxytocin levels. Anyway, so that's about it for me, is both investigating what are the cultural norms, how did we get there, and how can we use this as a wedge to start saying, there's evidence to suggest that we do work rather well when we're not in these kind of formal strictures. How do we save that? How do we explore that? And then for when we have to be in these distributed contexts, how do we best support that with the technology that we have so that we can always be as brilliant and resilient as possible?
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else have a research question for us? Baruch, do you have anything?
Yes, actually, I'm starting now a study about the returning to work and to see what kind of antecedents and outcomes will be when we return, when we have the option to return to work. What kind of managers will continue to allow their employees to work from home if they want? And this transition, what kind of learning we have from this experiment? These are my research questions, and I might go to them because usually I am studying people's career, but of course this is also a factor within people's career. And I do look forward to come back. And when I see you all, if I still recognize you, I will give you a big hug. I won't be able to recognize MC, so you'll have to give me a hug because you see me.
Thank you. I mean, you're right. This is a massive experiment, isn't it? This is the biggest sample size we've ever had for an experiment, isn't it? But we just really need to be sure that we are leading the field here, really, and ensuring that we keep things person-focused and focused on our well-being as we go forwards. Anne-Marie, research questions. Any thoughts?
So one of the things I would like to know is obviously we're using all this technology, and we're just trial and error at the moment. I mean, there must be sort of like some very best practices that we can use for engaging with students, engaging with the people in front of us, and also sort of rethinking how we engage with people on a face-to-face basis, because we all do it automatically because we've always done it as children. Sort of, you know, you've never needed to think about it, but it is an opportunity to think about, you know, when we communicate and how we communicate with people, and could we be doing it better?
Thank you. Yes. MC's just made a comment. I don't know if you can see the comments coming on the side. So Baruch, imagine if a month or two ago you had proposed an experiment to the ethical committee and said, I'm going to ask everyone in the world to work from home for 2 months and see what happens. So now, you know, the experiment is here for you without even that ethics review. We must take advantage of this.
Lucky me.
Exactly.
Oh, yes. So I see MC's comment saying there are entire journals and conferences in this area, but actually I just want an easy, quick sort of like 5 bullet points that actually spread throughout the university, spread throughout sort of, you know, the much wider society, rather than sort of, you know, a real in-depth analysis. I want to know how I can do it, you know, on a day-to-day basis now, rather than actually having to go deeply into things to actually find out how to do it.
I think it's a shame that we have this live experiment and not have the ethical approval to do certain things. So, for example, I would actually like to see how people, I can sort of observe what we are doing in our own meeting, but I'd like to see some of the political meetings or some of the management meetings and see how they really negotiate with language and with all the technology, how they make decisions in these meetings, and obviously by the time I have that through ethical approval and have written to people and got participants for this, this will all be over. Hopefully not. There will probably be more people working in these online platforms, and it will be really interesting to look what changes and how people try to adapt to that.
Now, Stefan, you have been what I think we would refer to as lurking on this online forum, and you as well, Richard. So, Stefan, obviously such a lot for us to think about here. What are your thoughts on research questions going forward?
Can you hear me? Oops. Sorry, I can't hear you. For some reason, my technology is, ever since we lost one of our members, I can only listen through the YouTube channel, but that creates some disturbances here. I've got plenty of research questions that are coming out from here, and I think that the question is how we reshape the communication after the crisis, so that we continue with the best practice. Unfortunately, this is very difficult to just coming down to collecting the best ideas from people. What we really need to is a better understanding of how we in the virtual space can communicate and understand each other better. I'm quite interested in the questions as how we with multimedia approaches. So not MC was alluding to that, and I completely agree with that. Not only about the question of seeing, I completely agree. It's better to see each other in a conference like that, just to stay alert. But it's also when you do that, I'm sure you all have the experience. If you do 4 or 5 of these video conferences every day, it just gets very, very tiresome. For me, it's more stressful, much more stressful than being in the room with the person. And if we manage to get the best practice of trusting our employees and our people that they can work at home. I had a really interesting discussion with all of our admin staff today that felt as happy as never before, because they actually can do exactly what they did at university. but in a much more friendly environment and much more productive. And they were basically asking if they can carry on working like that forever. And I've got full sympathy for them. But we need to combine these things, and how we research that is the real question. I don't know. This is bigger than any of us. Each of us has a different aspect of that, from business, from technology, from linguistics, from whatever. But how we get that into coherent research, I don't really know.
Thank you, Stefan. Now I'm just going to sneak in a question for Anne-Marie, actually, and it's more to help me really in my work. So a lot of my work is focused on digital health, telemedicine, and previously there has been massive organizational barriers to doing things remotely. So information governance being the main thing, and all the separate NHS trusts obviously have their own information governance teams, their own approvals in order to provide digital health. And I just wondered, do you think some of these barriers are actually going to be broken down now?
So I totally agree with you. I mean, it actually changes the nature of the research that we do, because, you know, certainly sort of like for the students, you know, the actual idea of going through ethics and HRA approval and is just so much more complicated than we can fit in within the time allowed for their research projects. And so we deliberately choose projects that, you know, that don't have to go through IRAS. I really hope that will be the case. At the moment, we are still seeing sort of evidence that if you do secondary data analysis for patient data, then you still need to go back and get NHS approval for that secondary data analysis, which was a way that we were hoping to furnish for our MSc students who don't have the ability to collect any data at this moment in time. And a lot of countries, you're not seeing the same need to do that kind of level of in-depth regulatory approvals. And so a lot of people are moving their research into other countries where that is the case. So I really, really hope so.
Yeah, I mean, Stefan, we were talking about this in terms of general practitioners, GPs and doctors. You know, they've been talking for like 20 years about doing remote consultations and saying, oh, this would be good, but what about the information governance? And then suddenly they have to do it. So is this going to persist? You know, have we broken down some of those barriers already?
I can talk about the GPs. I think that will persist because they just had to overcome the initial hurdle and the technological hurdle, which they had to do, as you say, in the last 4 weeks. And all of them are very happy with it. And the patients are extremely happy with that, because they don't have to go to practice. They sit at home and wait for the GP to call. So that's bound to stay with us as a positive change, I think, to all of our lives.
Thank you. Richard, over to you. So in terms of communication, you have done so well to set us all up to be kind of in the same room together. So what thoughts has this provoked for you? What are you thinking in terms of research questions? So many things, probably.
Yeah, I think, well, Stefan said he wasn't sure how this all comes together into a coherent thing. I think for me, we're still at that diverging phase where we're all broadening our horizons and trying to work out what we have in common and whose questions are the same as each other's, and who can help answer one another's questions. I think the things for me are that we talked about a lot of the gaps in these different technologies, and you know, we've got this trade-off between seeing someone's face that Yehuda brings up versus the fact that if you can see someone's face on a computer, you can't move around. And you can't do that sort of walking together type experience that MC correctly brings up. So I think for me, just understanding some of those trade-offs and actually what those gaps are really specifically, what is it that we're missing, so that we know what it is we're trying to put back in some sense. And I think specifically within that, the idea of communal experience seemed really important, that we talked about around films and how we fill that in. So I know with some of my friends, we started a Minecraft server just because we wanted something to do together, so that it's not all about the communication. You're communicating while you're building a fort or something. And I wonder what we can find that brings some of that back, and what that looks like around things like films and media and culture. Likewise, in the workplace, so much of my roles is trying to bring these workshops together and do sort of design thinking exercises with people. And I've certainly been scratching my head around how we get that experience of everyone having a post-it note full of, or a table full of post-it notes, and they can move the post-it notes around. We don't really have that at the moment. So I think there's some quick sort of interaction design wins, but then those gnarlier problems that, as MC says, actually are quite old and people have been grappling with for a while around what is it that we're missing and how do we fill it in.
Thank you so much. I mean, you're absolutely right. We need to first know what is missing, and then we can work out how to add that in future. So that's what needs to be measured really at this point, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to draw things to a close now. So I want to say a big thank you to everybody for taking part. So thank you, Yehuda. Ruby and Daria have had to leave, as has Jane, but thank you so much to them. Thank you, MC. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, Michael. I think of course, it has just opened up so many more questions, and we'll all be thinking about this for a little while. I'm very encouraged to see that MC has mentioned that an online meeting increases your brain's need for sugar. So I'm hoping that my daughter is going to have baked something this afternoon, and I won't feel too guilty if I overindulge this evening. So thank you for that, MC. So let's all stay in touch. We're going to be organising more seminars, so keep an eye on your inbox. And yes, it will be lovely to see you all in person at some point in the future.
Here, thank you very much.
Thanks for organising this. It's really great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.